clear. So I think we laid out some of the predicates. One is, when you talk about middle powers, we're talking about those three elements of credibility, coalition building, and at the same time, basic capacity. And at the same time, of course, a while ago, we also saw the ebbs and flows of Philippine foreign policy, which brings us to the final part. And I'll try to keep this as short as possible because I want to open it up to some reactions. You're free to check longer versions of this earlier talk I gave at UC Berkeley and Stanford earlier this year. So you can just check that online, but I'll just compress it and try to tweak it to our conversations here. I also have a paper with La Trobe University, the Blue Security, with Elena Noor and Hunter Martson and our good friends, comparison of different Southeast Asian countries dealing with this. So if you want more detailed versions, I'm more than happy to share that. So let me just give a very compressed version of this conversation. I think the best way to understand how the Philippines is approaching the geopolitical environment and uncertainties is the hedging strategy, right? So I think that literature on hedging is very useful to the Philippines in ways that I don't think has been appreciated enough. Because both internally and externally, there's always this misconception or simplistic characterization of the Philippines as some sort of a banana republic, which is either an American satellite state or the next big Cambodia, right? So during Duterte, at least on the surface, you would think that the Philippines is competing with Cambodia for gold medal for loyalty to China. So sometimes I don't know who's the special friend of China. Is it Hun Sen? Is it Rodrigo Duterte? And then at the same time, it's easy to dismiss. Marcos essentially is Aquino 2.0. Aquino essentially is an American proxy. That's the kind of discourse you hear both internally and externally. And from what I understand, there are some of our friends in the region who are trying to portray us, no offense to our friends from Australia, as the deputy sheriff of US in Southeast Asia, right? Trying to dismiss us as an outside actor. And indeed, we feel very isolated in the region in the sense that we feel we're always the country that takes the punches, whether on the arbitration case, whether on the transparency initiative in recent years, and that the rest of ASEAN either alienates us, either piggy banks on us, or gaslights us and say, oh, you are creating too much trouble. And it's like, wait, where is the original sin again? We're not the one claiming 85% of the water. But one of the things I keep on hearing from our ASEAN counterparts, among others, is that you're just wild in terms of the swings of your foreign policy, from Aquino to Duterte and Marcos. And this is where hedging comes in the picture. My contention is that the swings are more in terms of rhetoric and positioning and posturing. But if you look at the full thrust of the Philippine defense and foreign policy, it is really an emerging middle-sized country really trying to just survive and protect the minimums, meaning its sovereign rights and a certain degree of strategic autonomy. And yes, because we have been a US ally and very dependent on that alliance for a long time, while fighting all of these insurgencies, strategic culture is something we're still working on. Therefore, I treat these conversations honestly as a kind of an activist approach to helping level up the strategic culture in this country. I think it's all very important to recognize how far this country has come. I remember a conversation on the sides with some veterans in South Carolina during a talk I gave there earlier this year, and someone asked me, so you guys have any ships or something to defend yourself? So my understanding is that many people don't even recognize that the Philippines has been spending billions of dollars over the past decade or so across 3 administrations that on the surface look completely contradictory, but actually there has been a steady buildup in the Philippines' capability. Just a few months ago, we got in the $300 million supersonic missile system from our Indian friends with the Russian derivative. I'm talking about BrahMos. We're looking at acquiring also not only HIMARS, but potentially Typhoon, MRC medium-range capability. We are in conversations, and you can check a new report by Heritage Foundation that we really pushed them, not Project 2025, but a different paper on how the US can help the Philippines by making the acquisition of advanced F-16 fighters as feasible and as sustainable as possible. So this is a conversation that we have successfully injected into even the Republican DC circles conversation. And as we speak, we are hoping to allocate up to $35 billion over the next 10 years to build up our basic capabilities. You will say, oh, how can you afford that? Well, we have already $500 billion GDP, which is going to be $1 trillion economy in the coming years. We're not a wealthy country. We're not quote unquote first world, but we're a middle income country that is building that minimum resources to have that minimal capacity and investment in our armed forces in ways we have not been able to do in the previous half a century, just to put it honestly. So we're not here to be salesmen and say Philippines is now a great power. What we're saying is that we used to be 2 out of 10, we're getting towards 6 out of 10. And even at a 6 out of 10, the Philippines will be in a position to exercise a certain degree of strategic autonomy and to be able to also protect its basic interests in this part of the world. Now, why is hedging a very important concept? My contention here is that hedging is instinctive to all of us in Southeast Asia, precisely because of the trauma of Cold War period, when we were essentially split among not one, not two, but even three major powers. I mean, it most dramatically in the case of Indochina, where the Maoist China will play its own game, Soviet Union will play its own game, and the Kissingers and CIAs and Americans playing their own game. So that traumatic experience has really informed our strategic perceptions and culture. And Philippines, as a key US ally, we were directly involved not only in Korean War, but in the Vietnam War and beyond. So the reality is that we don't want to get into that situation where we feel helpless. And we don't want to get into a situation where we're forced to make choices. But not making choices is a choice in itself, and it's a luxury if you do not back it up with capability and purpose. And that is something that all of us in Southeast Asia are working on to different degrees of success. And I'll tell you what, all of us are struggling. Even Vietnam is struggling. Anyone who's familiar actually with what's happening in Vietnam would realize that even the Vietnamese are scratching their head and wondering. I mean, of course, they're happy to have Putin this day and then Biden the next day and Xi Jinping. On the surface, they are the masters of bamboo diplomacy. But behind the scenes, if you talk to the Vietnamese, they'll say, actually, we don't know how we're going to deal with China in the coming years. We don't even know how we're going to deal with Trump in the coming years. And Russia, well, it's a complicated issue, right? But we need to still buy those weapon systems. So kind of similar to the dilemma that India also has when it comes to their defense acquisitions from Russia and implications for Western relations. The Singaporeans have their own headache. And you can see the swings in their rhetoric and all. And good luck to Prabowo in Indonesia and how he's going to do his own Duterte version of foreign policy. So what I'm saying is that sometimes we exaggerate how unique or exceptional the Philippines is, as exceptional as we are as the sole liberal democracy and US treaty ally in this part of the world. And hedging really makes sense because it's dialectical and it's asymmetric, right? It's asymmetric not in a sense that, I mean, people think that hedging means 50% distance from US, 50% distance from China. That doesn't make sense. If you're Cambodia, it could be more like 80-20. If you're Philippines, it will be 90-10 because US is a treaty ally and China is threatening us in the South China Sea. So it's asymmetric. But it's also dialectical, meaning it is shaped by actual material circumstances on the ground, but also the strategic discourse that shapes the thinking of our political elite and also our interaction with the rest of the region and our American and great power counterparts. Now, the reality, though, is I always hear this ad infinitum. Our Singaporean friends love to always use this Tanzanian, that proverb, African proverb, when two elephants make love and we're like the grass and all of that. I said, what about the Indians? But my point is, we are actually more in a savanna, where you have two big elephants, but you have all sorts of different animals out there who have different degrees of agencies. But it is bounded agency, the same way that rationality is also bounded. And if you look at it, in the case of Southeast Asia, it's really 50 shades of hedging. Different countries calibrating, recalibrating, and really struggling for autonomy under the most impossible circumstances. It's almost an odyssey. It's almost a struggle, a culture of struggle. And when it comes to the Philippines, my contention is that, last 5 minutes, my contention is that we are as instinctive as a lot of our Southeast Asian partners, and then increasingly hedging has become an existential issue because of the uncertainties with America's position in this part of the world, but also fears about what China is doing. And I'll end on this point because I want to really open it up for discussion. My fear and my fundamental fear with the next American administration and with the direction of great power competition is that at some point it may become almost impossible for Philippines to hedge anymore. I think we might reach a point whereby we'll have only performative hedging. In a sense that Marcos in 2025 and 2026 says, we want to have great relationship with all superpowers, but in reality, the Americans are pressing us down in the North to be involved in the Taiwan question. The Americans are pressing us down and saying, we're helping you in the South China Sea, but you cannot hedge. My sense is with the hawkish Trump team, they have very limited patience for hedging. especially if you're a frontline state, especially if you're a US treaty ally, and especially if you're expecting to get hundreds of millions or billions of aid, because as you know, over the next 5 years, we're expected to get at least a $3 billion defense aid by the US. It's bipartisan, so no problem with Trump or anyone being there. So what I'm saying is that as much as we're all hedging and we have the 50 shades of hedging, it might come to a point whereby the US will force us, especially countries like the Philippines, to make a choice. And personally, I'm quite worried about that because I want us to still have some room for maneuver. But believe me or not, I'm an isolated voice. There's so many Filipinos we can talk to, especially elite, who will say we're more than happy to be Team America, Team Trump, right? And go against China. And to be honest, for me, that's worrying because that shows a shallowness of strategic culture and thinking. Because if you go to Japan, I've been in Tokyo, Japan twice this year. I was in Berlin, we met Chancellor Scholz. If you talk to other key US allies, as close as they are to the US, they want to preserve their strategic autonomy. That is extremely important for them. That is the cornerstone of EU's foreign policy. So I think that's what we also have to do here in the Philippines. Okay, I think that should roil the room. Okay, now let's go and have your violent reactions. More than welcome. You're free. We actually are missing the most important speaker, Joshua, who actually organized this. He was supposed to lay things out. So I hope what we did in bits and pieces still gives you some, elements of what we're trying to arrive here in this discussion. Looking forward to your question and answer in the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you.